Studies at the University of Michigan show that people who can stay emotionally connected during conflict have relationships that actually grow stronger over time, while those who withdraw or attack during disagreements see their relationships deteriorate. Jesus was teaching advanced relationship psychology 2,000 years before we had the science to prove it. Here's what neuroscience reveals about Jesus's love your enemies teaching. When you maintain compassionate awareness towards someone who's triggered you, your brain literally rewires itself for stronger relationships. Dr. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin used brain imaging to study what happens when people practice loving kindness meditation, which is essentially what Jesus was describing. The results were extraordinary. After just 8 weeks of practice, subjects showed increased activity in areas of the brain associated with empathy and emotional regulation. But more importantly, they showed decreased activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, when faced with stressful social situations. They had literally trained their brains to stay connected instead of going into fight or flight mode during conflict. This is why Jesus emphasized that loving your enemies isn't just good for them, it's good for you. When you practice maintaining compassionate awareness toward difficult people, you're building what psychologists call emotional immunity. You become less reactive, more centered, and paradoxically, more attractive to healthy people. Dr. John Gottman's research on marriage found that couples who can maintain positive regard for each other, even during arguments, have a 94% chance of staying together. Those who resort to contempt, criticism, or withdrawal have an 81% chance of divorce. Jesus was teaching relationship skills that modern science proves are essential for long-term connection. But the most profound insight is this. Jesus understood that the second fundamental human need is authentic belonging. Not just being around people, but feeling truly seen and accepted. And the paradox is that you can only achieve authentic belonging by being willing to stay present with people even when they're not at their best. When you practice loving your enemies, you're not just improving your relationships with difficult people. You're developing the emotional skills that make you capable of true intimacy with everyone. You're learning to love the whole person, not just the parts that are easy to love. This is why people who have integrated this teaching report feeling less lonely even when they're alone, and more connected even with strangers. They've developed what researchers call secure attachment, the ability to maintain their emotional center while staying open to genuine connection. Think of relationships like Wi-Fi networks. Most people are constantly searching for the perfect network, one that's always strong, never has any interference, and gives them exactly what they want. When they encounter a weak signal or some static, they immediately disconnect and start searching for something better. But here's what Jesus understood. The strongest relationships aren't found by searching for perfect networks. They're built by learning how to maintain connection, even when there's interference. When someone is difficult or reactive, they're basically broadcasting static. Most people respond by either disconnecting entirely, withdrawal, or trying to overpower the static with their own signal, fighting back. But Jesus taught a third option, staying connected while maintaining your own clear signal. This is what loving your enemies actually means. It's a technical instruction for relationship management. Don't absorb their static, don't disconnect from them, and don't broadcast static back. Maintain your connection while keeping your signal clear and strong. People who master this skill become like high-quality routers. They can maintain stable connections even in challenging environments. Others are naturally drawn to them because they feel safe. They know this person won't disconnect the moment things get difficult. This is why Jesus' followers formed such strong communities. It wasn't because they all agreed about everything or because they were naturally compatible people. It was because they had learned the psychological skill of maintaining connection during conflict. The second fundamental need is authentic belonging, feeling truly known and accepted. But you can only experience authentic belonging when you're with people who won't abandon you the moment you're not at your best. And you can only attract those people by becoming someone who won't abandon others when they're struggling. Most people are so busy searching for perfect relationships that they never develop the skills to build resilient ones. They optimize for compatibility instead of connection and end up lonely even when they're surrounded by people who are just like them. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit that like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in my next videos. Here's the final and most important mystery that modern psychology is just beginning to solve. Why do some people continue growing and evolving throughout their entire lives, while others get stuck in patterns of stagnation and regret? The answer lies in Jesus' most revolutionary teaching, one that reveals the third fundamental psychological need that determines whether you'll live with increasing wisdom or increasing bitterness. When Jesus taught his followers to pray, "Thy will be done," most people think he was promoting passive submission to an external authority. But what Jesus was actually describing is what researchers now call psychological integration, the ability to align your conscious intentions with deeper wisdom that transcends your ego's limited perspective. Dr. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying what he called individuation, the psychological process by which people become whole and authentic. His research revealed that people who continue growing throughout their lives share one crucial characteristic. They've learned to recognize and trust a source of wisdom within themselves that's larger than their conscious mind. Modern neuroscience has proven that Jung was right. We now know that your brain contains multiple processing systems. Your prefrontal cortex handles conscious decision-making, but your limbic system and unconscious networks are constantly processing vast amounts of information that never reaches conscious awareness. People who learn to integrate these different levels of knowing make better decisions and report higher life satisfaction. But here's what's fascinating. Jesus identified this exact psychological principle when he taught about prayer. "Thy will be done" isn't about submitting to an external deity. It's about learning to align your conscious will with the deeper intelligence that emerges when all parts of your psyche are working together. This is why Jesus emphasized that the kingdom of heaven is within you. He was pointing to an internal state of psychological integration, where your ego mind learns to collaborate with deeper sources of wisdom instead of trying to control everything through force and analysis alone. Research at institutions like Johns Hopkins and NYU shows that people who regularly practice this kind of integrative awareness, whether through prayer, meditation, or other contemplative practices, show measurable improvements in decision-making, creativity, and emotional resilience. Here's the revelation that connects all three psychological needs and explains why Jesus' sermon has remained relevant for 2,000 years. He wasn't just teaching individual techniques, he was describing a complete system for psychological evolution that modern science is finally catching up to. The Lord's Prayer isn't a religious ritual. It's a psychological technology for integrating all three fundamental human needs. Our Father in heaven establishes connection to transcendent purpose. The first need, "Give us this day our daily bread," acknowledges dependence on community and relationship. The second need, "Thy will be done," develops trust in integrated wisdom. The third need, Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA has spent decades researching what he calls integration, the process by which different parts of the brain learn to work together harmoniously. His findings are revolutionary. People with high neural integration show greater emotional resilience, better relationships, more creativity, and what he calls response flexibility, the ability to pause between stimulus and reaction and choose their response consciously. But here's what's mind-blowing. The specific practices Jesus taught, contemplative prayer, service to others, forgiveness, and what he called dying to self, are precisely the activities that neuroscience proves most effectively develop neural integration. When Jesus talked about being born again, he wasn't describing a one-time religious experience. He was describing ongoing psychological transformation that modern research shows is possible throughout the entire lifespan. What neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, Jesus called spiritual rebirth. The three temptations Jesus faced in the wilderness map perfectly onto what researchers identify as the three main obstacles to psychological growth. The temptation to use power for personal gain, ego inflation. the temptation to test limits destructively, compulsive risk-taking, and the temptation to worship false gods, addiction to external validation. This is why Jesus' teachings have survived every cultural change for 2 millennia. They're not based on temporary cultural values or outdated cosmology. They're based on permanent features of human psychological architecture that remain constant across time and culture. The Sermon on the Mount isn't ancient history. It's a user manual for human consciousness that we're only now sophisticated enough to understand scientifically. Jesus saw patterns in human nature that we're just beginning to prove with brain imaging and longitudinal studies. Think of your consciousness like a symphony orchestra. You have dozens of different instruments: your emotions, your analytical mind, your intuition, your body's wisdom, your social instincts. Most people go through life with each section playing a different song, creating psychological noise and exhaustion. Jesus understood that the third fundamental need is integration, learning to conduct your internal orchestra so all the parts work together harmoniously. Thy will be done is the moment when your ego mind stops trying to play all the instruments itself and learns to trust the deeper conductor that can hear the whole symphony. When your psychological orchestra is integrated, something magical happens. You start making decisions that satisfy multiple levels of your being simultaneously. You choose work that pays the bills and aligns with your values. You enter relationships that feel exciting and stable. You take risks that are adventurous and wise. People with integrated consciousness don't struggle with the same internal conflicts that exhaust everyone else. They're not constantly torn between what they think they should do and what they actually want to do, because those two things start pointing in the same direction. This is why Jesus seemed so effortlessly powerful, not because he never faced difficult decisions, but because he had learned to access a level of knowing that transcended the limited perspective of ego thinking. He could see patterns and possibilities that others missed, because he wasn't filtering everything through the narrow lens of personal survival and control. Most people spend their entire lives trying to force their way to happiness through willpower and strategy alone. They're like a conductor trying to control the orchestra by shouting louder and waving more frantically. But the musicians can't hear the music. They can only hear the noise. Jesus taught that there's a different way, learning to trust the intelligence that emerges when all parts of yourself are aligned and working together. This isn't mystical thinking. It's practical psychology that modern neuroscience is proving to be more effective than pure rational analysis for complex life decisions. These 3 psychological needs, transcendent purpose, authentic belonging, and integrated wisdom, aren't just ancient teachings. They're the foundation of human thriving that modern science is finally sophisticated enough to understand. Jesus didn't just preach religion, he diagnosed the human condition with surgical precision and provided a complete system for psychological evolution that remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. The next time someone tells you that science and spirituality are incompatible, remember this: the greatest psychological insights of our time are confirmations of wisdom that was hiding in plain sight for millennia. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion about the ideas presented in this content? Leave it in the comments. Send this news to that friend of yours who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on public information and historical texts, not clinical diagnosis. It represents an interpretive framework connecting psychological research with ancient teachings for educational purposes. What if I told you that 2,000 years ago, a single sermon identified the 3 core psychological needs that modern scientists are still trying to understand? Jesus' Sermon on the Mount wasn't just spiritual teaching, it was the world's first psychological blueprint for human fulfillment. Harvard researchers, Stanford psychologists, and neuroscientists at Yale are now discovering that this ancient text contains insights about human nature that we're only beginning to grasp. Today, I'm going to reveal the 3 hidden psychological principles embedded in Jesus' words that explain why some people thrive while others struggle, and how understanding them can transform your life completely. If you're building a meaningful life, the most powerful psychological framework in history has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. What neuroscience reveals about this sermon will change everything you thought you knew. Here's what most people don't understand about happiness. We've been looking for it in completely the wrong places. For decades, psychologists believed that fulfillment came from external achievements, money, status, recognition. But there was always this nagging problem. Why do some of the most successful people feel empty inside? Why do celebrities struggle with depression? Why do lottery winners often end up miserable? The answer was hiding in plain sight in the opening lines of Jesus' most famous sermon, when Jesus began the Beatitudes with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Most people think he was talking about humility or religious devotion. But modern psychology has uncovered something far more profound. Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania spent decades studying what he calls authentic happiness. His research with thousands of subjects revealed that true fulfillment doesn't come from getting what you want. It comes from aligning your life with something bigger than yourself. But here's the twist. Jesus identified this exact psychological principle 2,000 years before Seligman was even born. The phrase "poor in spirit" isn't about being humble. It's about recognizing that your ego, your small self, isn't the source of meaning. It's the psychological state of being open to transcendent purpose. Jesus was describing what we now call self-transcendence, the first fundamental human need that modern psychology has proven essential for mental health. But most people completely miss this connection. They read the Beatitudes as religious platitudes instead of seeing them as a sophisticated map of human psychological architecture. Jesus wasn't just preaching, he was diagnosing the human condition with surgical precision. Here's what will blow your mind. When researchers at Stanford analyzed brain scans of people experiencing deep fulfillment, they found something extraordinary. The subjects weren't thinking about themselves at all. Their brains showed activation in regions associated with meaning-making and connection to larger purposes, exactly what Jesus described as being poor in spirit. Dr. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, spent his entire career proving that humans can endure almost anything if they have a sense of purpose that transcends their personal circumstances. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, became one of the most influential psychology texts ever written. But Frankl himself admitted that his insights weren't original. He was simply rediscovering what spiritual traditions had known for millennia. The Beatitudes aren't random blessings, they're a precise sequence describing the psychological journey from emptiness to fulfillment. Blessed are those who mourn isn't about sadness. It's about the necessary psychological process of letting go of illusions. Research from the University of California shows that people who can sit with difficult emotions without trying to escape them develop what psychologists call emotional resilience. Blessed are the meek isn't about being weak. It's about what researchers now call psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt your behavior to your values rather than your impulses. Studies at Harvard proved that people with high psychological flexibility report significantly higher life satisfaction and lower rates of anxiety and depression. Each beatitude maps onto a specific psychological state that modern research has proven essential for human thriving. Jesus wasn't teaching religion, he was teaching applied psychology. The kingdom of heaven, he kept referring to, wasn't a place you go after death. It was a psychological state you can achieve right now by understanding how your mind actually works. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. Jesus identified these patterns by observing human nature, not by conducting controlled studies. He saw something about the human psyche that we're only now proving scientifically. This wasn't divine revelation in the supernatural sense. It was divine revelation in the sense of perfectly accurate psychological insight. Explicação simplificada plus analogia. Target 2,500 characters. Think of your psychological needs like a smartphone. You can have the most advanced device in the world, but if it's not connected to a network bigger than itself, it's useless. That's exactly what Jesus understood about human fulfillment. Most people try to find happiness by upgrading their personal device. Better job, nicer house, more achievements. But they're still operating in airplane mode, disconnected from any larger network of meaning. They wonder why they feel isolated and empty, despite having everything they thought they wanted. Jesus identified that the first psychological need is connection to transcendent purpose, plugging into a network bigger than your individual self. Modern psychology calls this self-transcendence, and research proves it's the foundation of mental health. When you're poor in spirit, you're admitting that your individual ego network isn't enough. You're opening yourself to connect with something larger, whether that's serving others, pursuing truth, creating beauty, or building something meaningful. The moment you make that connection, your entire psychological operating system changes. This is why people who volunteer for causes they believe in report higher happiness levels than people focused only on personal gain. It's why artists who create for the love of creation are more fulfilled than those who create only for fame. It's why parents often say that having children gave their lives meaning. They never knew was missing. Jesus wasn't asking people to be religious. He was teaching them how to properly configure their psychological operating system. The kingdom of heaven is what happens when you're running on the right network, connected to purposes bigger than your individual desires. But most people never make this connection because they're too busy trying to upgrade their device instead of finding the right network. They're optimizing the wrong thing entirely. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will explode your understanding of human psychology, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Here's the second mystery that stumped psychologists for decades. Why do some people form deep, meaningful relationships while others feel lonely even when surrounded by people? The answer lies in one of Jesus's most misunderstood teachings. And it reveals the second fundamental psychological need that determines whether you'll thrive or struggle in life. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," most people think he was being naive or unrealistic. How can you love someone who hurts you? What Jesus was actually describing wasn't about warm feelings. It was about a sophisticated psychological strategy that researchers are only now beginning to understand. Dr. Robert Waldinger, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest-running study of happiness in history, has followed the same group of people for over 80 years. His findings are shocking. The quality of your relationships is the single strongest predictor of life satisfaction, mental health, and even physical health. People with strong relationships live longer, have stronger immune systems, and report significantly higher happiness levels. But here's the paradox that confused researchers. The people with the strongest relationships weren't the ones who only connected with people they naturally liked. They were the ones who had developed what psychologists now call relational resilience, the ability to maintain connection even during conflict. Jesus identified this exact principle when he taught about loving enemies. He wasn't promoting doormat behavior or telling people to accept abuse. He was describing a psychological skill that modern research proves is essential for healthy relationships. The ability to separate the person from their behavior, to maintain your emotional center even when others are reactive.